It is now time for Bradford and Brooks, a civil discourse about civil affairs in Bardstown, Kentucky, and around the world. Please welcome your host for Bradford and Brooks, Margie Bradford and Jim Brooks. Now, get ready to enjoy a community forum to encourage citizen participation in the political process by the thoughtful discussion of political and civil issues.
Good morning, Bardstown and Nelson County, and welcome to a very special Friday edition of Bradford and Brooks. Jim Brooks here with my co-host, Margie Bradford, on this beautiful Friday morning. And we'll be with you through the top of the hour. We've got a couple of guests we'll be talking with, one of which is a candidate for state constitutional office. But before we get to our interview, Margie wants to make a shameless plug for a political event. Go ahead, Margie.
I'll remember that when you do your shameless plugs. Yes, well, tonight, of course, is the annual Democratic dinner, and it will take place at the Maywood Country Club. There's a meet and greet from 6 to 7, dinner at 7. You can buy tickets at Kenny's Cleaners or Conway Heaton, or do it at the door. Admission is $45 each, or $50 if you wait until you get to the door and don't call someone, tell them you're coming. We have about 15 different political candidates who will be there, including, I think, all of the candidates for governor. So we invite everyone to come out and meet the candidates at Maywood tonight.
Democratic candidates for governor.
Democratic candidates, yes.
All right. Well, of course, this
Well,
is...
you got your sword out today, Jim.
Well, this is the Democratic Party's version of the same dinner that Republicans had earlier in the year.
Yes.
When I had an opportunity to meet our next guest here. This gentleman is seeking the Republican nomination for Secretary of State, Mr. Carl Nett. Good morning, Carl.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad to have you on, and you can tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your campaign for Secretary of State. And those of you who follow the Nelson County Gazette website or Facebook, you may remember from pictures from the dinner and seeing someone holding a Make America Great Again cake that was one of the desserts that was auctioned off at the end of the dinner, and that's always a fun auction. Anyway, Mr. Nett was the man holding the cake, and it was a great looking cake, but I think it was one of those cakes you look at and not one of the best ones to eat, perhaps. But but anyway, it was a hit with the people in the crowd. I think it was unique, the most unique dessert on the table, I would dare say.
I agree, it was. And as the candidate known as Carl Trump Nett, I had to pick it out. So.
Well, my wife did the picking for our table, and I told her, I said, you got to get that cake. And no, it didn't work that way. She wouldn't do it. But of course, she's the peacemaker, so she bought a plate of chocolate-covered like Buckeyes, and so that everybody could have 2 or 3 instead of trying to slice a cake up evenly 11 ways. So.
Right.
So anyway, that worked. Portion control and all that good stuff. Well, Carl, tell us a little bit about yourself and what prompted you to throw your hat in the ring for Secretary of State.
Well, first of all, I'm a native Kentuckian. I was born and raised in Louisville. That's where I went to school. And I grew up in a few other places, including here in Bardstown. My mom was raised as the second youngest of 13 kids out on Springfield Road. She used to work in antebellum dress as a young lady at my old Kentucky home. Oh, yeah. So I've got a lot of kinfolk out here. It's always good to be here. I grew up in part in Hardin County. That's where Mom and Dad are now retired to their beef cattle farm. And also spent a lot of my youth in Frankfort. My dad was a Democrat state rep for 20 years. He's now a Republican like all of his children. So he made the switch so he could support me in the May primary, among other reasons. But I grew up, as I say, in Kentucky, but I left after 9/11. after the attack on our country. My application with the U.S. Secret Service arrived in the mail on September 10th, just one day prior. I was filling that out when I saw the towers fall on TV in front of us.
Wow.
And exactly 1 year later, I found myself at the Pentagon for the rededication. They called it Project Phoenix. President Bush was there to unveil the revamped building. I was an early entry trainee. They called us EETs for short. We called ourselves easily eliminated targets because we were not, as of yet, trained. We had no guns, no chem bio equipment, etc. But I went on to graduate from 2 paramilitary academies, FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. That's in Artesia, New Mexico, the one I went to. And then the Secret Service Academy in Beltsville, Maryland. Did 6 years with the Presidential Protective Division. And then resigned my commission in early 2008 when I was offered a job supporting the CIA's National Clandestine Service. So shortly into that venture, they asked me if I would undertake a hazardous duty assignment in Afghanistan. I said yes. They trained me at their facility known as The Farm. That's at Camp Perry in Williamsburg, Virginia. And then I went to Bagram, where I worked with Special Operations Forces to target Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Haqqani network members, other bad guys. 2011, my career came full circle. The Pentagon asked me to lead a specialized unit at Joint Task Force Guantanamo Bay, where I came face to face with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the so-called mastermind of 9/11.
Right.
I've also received an offer from the FBI as a special agent, which I turned down to do my CIA mission. And I've written a couple books, one of which I've published in 2013. It's an anthology of U.S. history. As my wife will tell you, I was a nerd before I picked up a weapon for the government. So I got some folks to endorse that, including a few prominent Democrats, Bill Richardson, who ran for president,
Right.
and then the late Zell Miller, the former Georgia governor, U.S. senator, and a couple other folks, Edgar Mitchell, who's also now deceased. He's the 6th man to walk on the moon, a great NASA pioneer,
Absolutely.
and Herschel Woody Williams, who's the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of Iwo Jima, where, of course, Marines raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi. But I moved back to Kentucky several years ago with my wife. She's a New England native. We purchased the home that I grew up in Louisville. We're raising our 2 children there. We have a son who's almost 6. My daughter's 22 months. And to answer your question about politics, of course, I have a base level interest in this, having grown up in it. But I just look at what's going on in Frankfurt right now, and I think I have the right skill set at the right time in history for a few reasons. Number one, I'm a trained criminal investigator. I think that's important. We know that there's a lot of scandals surrounding the current administration. Ms. Grimes, her father's been indicted. She may well be indicted herself. That's my understanding. That's a possibility. So we need someone to go in there and clean up that office, not to go on a vendetta, but to, in the interest of accountability and transparency, I think, uncover what's been going on for the last 8 years and, put it out to the light of day. I'm also the only counterintelligence officer, I think, probably ever to seek this office. So I've got a unique skill set to handle these new and emerging threats from foreign intelligence agencies that impact our elections. This is also an administrative job, and I'm one of the most effective administrators in the country, having overseen one of the most sensitive and politically charged operations of the government at Joint Task Force Gitmo. And the last thing I would say that just sets me apart from others is that I'm the only candidate of either party who has an active top secret SCI clearance. And what that means and why that's important is that if I am the chief election official of Kentucky, if I'm the Secretary of State, then that will give me what's called need to know as it relates to information that relates to threats against our election system. But to get the classified information, you've got to have the appropriate clearance, and I have that. And I may very well be the only Secretary of State in the nation who can make that claim. And that's important. That's a tremendous benefit.
Well, Carl, the election security, of course, has been, that's been discussed a lot, and Russian influence on the 2016 election. I mean, we've heard lots of stories, and people believe that the Russians impacted it, but and in some ways they tried to shape it, of course, through Facebook ad buys, through third parties, etc. But what's your state? What do you see as what are there security issues with our Kentucky's voting procedures now?
Well, first of all, as it relates to the Russians, they've been trying to interfere in American politics going back to the Cold War. That's nothing new.
Right.
You have to separate the politics from the reality of this. I mean, we know that our president's very sensitive about claims of Russian interference, the inference being that the election was illegitimate. It wasn't. Their efforts were not successful, as some would like to believe that they were. Kentucky, we were not targeted. Doesn't mean we won't be in the future. But the biggest threat to foreign interference, the biggest example of foreign interference, is non-citizens voting in our elections, or the effort by some to have voting available, or ballots available in Spanish. I mean, that's something that I disagree with. We have a common language in this country, a common culture. I think we need to focus on assimilation. A big part of that is securing our border. You have to have the integrity of the ballot box. That's paramount. That's going to be my focus as chief election official. And on that front, I would point out that we have 48 counties in Kentucky where we have currently more registered voters than living, breathing citizens of voting age. And frankly, there are a lot of reasons for that, but it really has to do with not following the law, has to do with dropping the ball as it relates to the responsibilities of the chief election official, the Secretary of State. So I have a plan in place that's already been approved by the Supreme Court to go in and purge those voter rolls. What we'll do very briefly, if I can expound on that, is that we'll look at those who have been dormant for 2 federal election cycles or 8 years, folks that haven't voted, and then we will send them a prepaid postage mailer asking, are you still a resident of Kentucky? Are you still a voter? Are you still at this address? And it's prepaid, so we're not accused of making them pay for a stamp, which would be a poll tax and unconstitutional. If we don't get a response, we wait 2 more years, so that's a decade. And if they haven't voted, then we purge them from the voter rolls, citing change of address. Whether in fact it's because they have moved away, or they're now deceased, or they never existed, or they're foreign nationals, or whatever the case may be. And then going forward, you simply follow the law. I mean, we're tied into the Bureau of Vital Statistics, for example, so if one of us passes away, then they should be taken off the voter rolls. That's something that hasn't been happening.
Well, that seems to be purging voter rolls of people who have moved away. That seems to be kind of a hot button that kind of the third rail that people aren't really comfortable doing. And even though it's, when you have more registered voters than people living in a county or eligible to vote, clearly that speaks to, a need that, at least maintaining those rolls.
Sure. What it presents is an avenue to voter fraud. It doesn't mean that everyone is having votes cast in their name, but it's an avenue to fraud. And I can tell you from briefings that I've had with the FBI, double voting took place in the last election in November. There are people who voted 2 or more times in Kentucky. There are people who voted across state lines. Now, this is analogous to drugs at the border. If, Border Patrol takes a photo because they capture 10 tons of marijuana, well, that probably means another 50 tons have slipped through. And you look at our past election, we'll just look at recent history. We have a governor by virtue of 83 votes in the Republican primary. Back in 2015, we had a state house race here that was decided by 1 vote. The last thing we want, I think, any of us, irrespective of party, Democrats or Republicans, is to have a fraudulent election. So none of this is about voter suppression. This is about equal protection under the law. That's what it's about.
All right. What other changes or initiatives do you think are important if you were elected Secretary of State?
There are 3 main roles of the Secretary of State. The one we're talking about is Chief Election Official, and that's important. It's similar to my first job with the Secret Service. We do a lot of things there, including investigations, but you screw up an investigation, your name is mud for a few days in your field office, but you screw up protection, you lose President Kennedy, and you change national and world history. So rightfully, we focus on elections, those of us running for this position. But the 2 other roles are, number 1, Chief Business Official. I'm working with business leaders across Kentucky who, unlike me, I'm not a business owner in Kentucky. They deal with the online business portal. They've got a lot of complaints about that. So we're trying to streamline that, make it more efficient, make our government a servant of those who are driving the economic engine of the Commonwealth, as we should. And then probably the least known role of Secretary of State is Chief Advocate for Civic Engagement, which quite frankly is whatever the incumbent makes it to be.
Right.
But I have an obvious interest in U.S. history and transmitting the heritage and the history and the culture of our republic to future generations, the respect for our Constitution, our form of government, our institutions. So my focus, and I'm working with members of the American Legion and the Military Order of World Wars, is to bring that renewed focus on history and civics to the classrooms of Kentucky And we're developing a program also to introduce them specifically to the U.S. Constitution, starting as early as first grade. Not all of it, but a piece of it, progressing through high school. So by the time you're a high school graduate, whether you decide to go on to college or vocational school or mom and pop's business or sit on the couch and play video games for 40 years, then at least hopefully you're an expert on the fundamental document, the supreme law of the land. And maybe that'll make you a better citizen and more engaged in voting.
Sure.
Do you have any policies or plans for perhaps extending voting hours or making it easier for people to vote?
Well, I put forth a proposal that came up with mixed reviews, frankly, from folks in my own party about moving the voting day to a part of the weekend, whether it's a Saturday or Sunday. You know, if you look historically, the reason that the elections are on Tuesday goes back to having to deal with farmers markets and market day, and you know, of course, we had different modes of transportation then, and we were an agrarian society. Now we're more industrial. So that's one idea that I put forward, certainly.
What about hours for voting? Because I know that the voting hours are place constraints on those people who have to work on those days.
Sure, that's part of the proposal for pushing to a weekend. But yeah, we can. I'd be amenable to talking to the legislature about doing that. Of course, I don't have the power to do that. It's going to have to come from the legislature. But you're right. We can be an advocate for that.
Right.
What about restoration of voting rights for felons who have completed their, their paid their price for the crimes? What are your thoughts on that?
Generally speaking, I'm for it. There are some caveats to that. Of course, now if someone's been convicted of a crime for election fraud, then I'd say, well, the answer is no. You've blown your opportunity there. If you're talking about violent felons, again, I think you have to look at a case-by-case basis as well.
Well, I think we were referring to nonviolent felons because at least that's the only ones I've heard being discussed.
Yeah, I can tell you in the campaign trail, I've met a lot of people who tell me they can't vote, convicted felon, and they've been out of the incarceration for decades, and they're family people, and they have jobs, and they're contributing to society, and they're taxpayers.
Well, if the aim of punishment is to have you expiate your crime,
rehabilitation's our goal.
Then you stop short of letting them be rehabilitated.
Correct. Yeah, I agree.
And I think that has a lot of consequences because if they don't get to vote, then they have less invested mentally in the community and in the society.
Right, they're not a whole citizen.
Right.
When they clearly, as you say, have been rehabilitated, and it's not just voting; it's also a restoration of right to self-defense, carry a firearm.
Right.
So.
Right. The I think though, we had years ago when this show first started, we had a phone call from a gentleman who, when his youth, had committed a felony, and that felony, of course, he's 30 years ago is when that happened, but still, it affects his life almost daily. He can't vote. He's really scrutinized if he's looking for another job.
Oh yeah.
And so
you got that black mark.
Right. But but voting, and then when you think about, well, he's raised a family, and his kids have never seen him vote, and if the parents aren't doing it, they're not talking about it probably, and so we've got a whole generation coming up of parent felons who are disenfranchised from voting or ever getting that vote back, and then their kids don't. Kids learn so much by example.
Yeah, by default, they're.
Well, your first question was about an automatic restoration of rights, codified in law. But I would say to that gentleman, anybody else listening who's in that situation, you can apply for a pardon through the governor. So that is a route you can go as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but that places a burden that maybe they shouldn't have to go through.
Yeah, but for something as important as voting and carrying a firearm, et cetera, I would be motivated. Let me put it that way. If I were in that position.
But you're an intelligent, tuned-in kind of person, and educated, and know to do those things. But a lot of people wouldn't know to do them, or would feel a barrier there.
Yeah. And I think that some people are kind of feel disenfranchised and may assume, well, it won't do any good.
Yeah.
I won't do it.
Yeah.
because you have to
possible.
kind of have a positive mindset to pursue something like that, I think. Carl, you've been out on the campaign trail a while now. What are you hearing from voters about what do they want from their Secretary of State?
Well, to be honest with you, I find myself explaining to a lot of folks what the Secretary of State position does. But those who are in the know, what I hear is what I really expounded on at length here today and talk about in my speeches on the stump, which is about cleaning up our elections. Everybody, again, whether it's Democrat or Republican, I think people just want to have faith and confidence that when they go to vote, that their vote is counting and that their vote is counting with equal weight. It's not being canceled out by someone who's voting more than once or someone who's not constitutionally eligible to vote because they're not a resident of Kentucky or they're not a citizen of the United States or what have you. I think that's the most important thing.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Every time we talk about security in elections, I recall my days at Western Kentucky University. One of my journalism professors that taught public affairs reporting, he loved elections. And, I mean, Margie and I both, I mean, it's kind of our time when, we love the chaos and all the, and my hat is off, of course, to our folks over in the county clerk's office who make things look easy. They do
They do a great job.
do an excellent job.
I've served on that election commission. I know all the things that you have to go through to make
Let
sure
me just
that
say
the
on that,
elections are.
the county clerks are the ones who run the elections in Kentucky.
Right.
And
exactly.
I've talked to not all of them, but an awful lot of them. Again, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. And one of the chief criticisms they have of the status quo is that they're treated as subordinates
Right.
to the Secretary of State. And they are not subordinates. They are duly elected officials. They're the ones who do the heavy lifting.
Exactly.
They're the ones who get the brunt of the blame if things go wrong in the county.
Right.
So the role of Secretary of State, in my opinion, is to be a facilitator and a helpmate.
Excellent. Yeah, that's true because they're on the front line. They're doing they're really, doing the work with the public and because of the different areas that the offices cover. And as Secretary of State, you're really kind of a supporting role to help facilitate their success.
Right. Yeah, we need to have more face-to-face interaction, and that's difficult in a state as big as ours, in
Yeah.
120 counties. But we can also bring in some technology to help, including, something I'm very familiar with, secure video teleconferencing. So I think it's important to have some interaction between Frankfurt and our various locales.
Well, I think that that's a good message to get out because I think as a body, I think the county clerks feel disenfranchised or not listened to in some cases.
That's the feedback I've gotten, for sure. That and lack of uniformity, lack of consistency in the feedback they're getting when they call Frankfurt for advice and counsel on issue XYZ. The response depends on who they talk to and what day of the week they call. So we need to clean that up for sure.
Right.
Right. Well, what any other initiatives that you would like to see pursue as Secretary of State? I know that it sounds like education would be an important role as a history buff yourself, that so people understand why it's important to participate.
Yeah, that's why I want to make that my focus and why I'm working, as I say, with folks in the American Legion and the Military Order of World Wars, because I was asked a question on Kentucky Tonight. I came from a viewer. What am I going to do to increase voter turnout? And the truth is that every one of us running for public office, any office, we're trying to get out the vote. We're trying to get people to care about our elections. Here I am. I have a May 21 primary. I know that based upon history, comparable election years, turnout's going to be below 20% statewide. So my hope, as someone who wants to bring this renewed focus on history and civics to our classrooms, is that the byproduct of that is that people will be more engaged citizens. They'll want to not just vote, but they want to make informed votes and participate more fully in our democratic process.
Well, for people that are looking for more information on Carl Nett as a Republican candidate for Secretary of State, where should they look?
I have a website, carlnett.com. There's a low budget, but I think informative video there. It tells more about me and my background. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, and I would just encourage everybody out there, please go to the polls and vote. May 21. If Donald Trump were not elected president, Jim, we would never know all the scandals and corruption in these 3- and 4-letter agencies. And I'm here to tell you that if I'm not elected Secretary of State as a former criminal investigator, then there's a lot we're not going to know about what's been going on in Frankfurt for the last 8 years. This is unprecedented. Again, she's been stripped of her constitutional authorities. And I came out against it, but there's very real concerns that led to that. So it's important that I get in office. And just remind everyone to get out and vote May 21, Carl Nett, Republican primary. Nothing but net.
All right, Carl. Well, we wish you continued success on the campaign trail. And we will, Margie and I will be broadcasting live, I assume, from the Nelson County Clerk's office
That's right.
as the returns come in. There's nothing like an election night, but I can't imagine election night as a candidate watching the returns come in.
Well,
That's-
you get
that would have
involved
to
in
be-
something like this, you have to be prepared to lose. We all want to win, but you've got to be prepared to lose, and that's hard for a lot of folks because rejection's tough, anything
Sure
in
it is.
life. And running for statewide office, that's rejection on a big scale if you come up short. But I've got thick skin, I can take it, and but I'm the right guy for the job, and ask everybody for their vote.
All right, well, very good. And what about winning in November? You feel like you're going to, whoever the Democrats send out, whoever wins their primary, you're ready to take them on?
Well, now, I don't want to plug the Democrats. However, in Republican circles, we all operate under the belief that Ms. Heather French Henry is going to be the nominee. And I believe I've got the best chance to beat her. I know that if I'm the nominee of the Republican Party, I'll be able to say in the fall that I'm more qualified to be Miss America than she is to be Secretary of State.
Well, we will see how May 21st turns out.
Yes, sir.
In both parties. All right, Carl, thanks again for coming in today.
You bet. I appreciate it.
All right, we're going to take a commercial break, and Margie and I will have a new guest to talk with here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned. You're listening to Bradford and Brooks on WBRT.